Okay, so I'm going to see how this turns out. Um, cool. So the following document that I have to present is actually not my own, but someone that was a mutual friend of mine, um, Jason Limpeh. I'll have a picture of him up on screen. I may refer to him as Korean Jason. I do not wish to disrespect, but I also have Jason Lee, which I will refer to along with other people that I know, such as like Mustafa, Sarah, Vallejo, Kevin, a lot of big figureheads within the tri-state area in New York City. So this was a document that he made. It was a Facebook post, and he shared a lot of his ideas because primarily he played premium. And I'm going to read through the entire document and I'm going to express my own ideas, bring up things as they come up, attempt to add visualizations where possible, and try to better explain what is going on overall. So, just sharing something that took me a long time to learn, a list of considerations you need to make on your turn. Hope the new players here will find it useful, and the better players here will add on to it. These are not specific techniques, but considerations you need to make to get the edge over the opponent. In high tables, damage rules get broken, guarding rules get broken, all rules and techniques become water, so that I find that learning how to think benefits me more than special techniques. So this is a concept is something that separates a lot of good players from great players. Now, a big difference between a good and a great player can also be playing into variance. Now, it is very easy for you to be lucky one day and just hit D triggers offensively and defensively, and your momentum is just completely on point. You're just absolutely decimating your opponent. Not a problem. However, since Vanguard is a high variance based game, there are moments in which you need to play into it, and you can actually yield a lot of results. However, since it is variance based, that still means you need to have a strong set of fundamentals and follow them 9 out of 10 times. And within that 1/10 of a time where you're going to, it's going to be risk assessment, and you need to make sure that if you pull it off, can you win the game? Because in most instances, if you fail, that results in game right there. Bullet point 1, pushing your strat. During your turn, one of the most important considerations is of of course how you are pushing your strategy forward. However, this is where most of the mid and low table players simply mechanically go through their deck's design flow, attack and end it, there without considering the following. This is when most of such players like to say things that they lost because he got lucky, he drew this, he drew that, and I was unlucky because I got this and not that. And most people, when they enter the game, their mindset can go into this or develop into this when starting off in the game, or they think that they're getting hard stuck in some capacity because they're not thinking beyond it. And this is all things that we'll go into. So, bullet point 1.1, what is stride? When pushing your first stride, a lot of people mechanically stride their best stride without considering if that stride is going to be a kill stride or not. Mechanically striding Ichikishima or Morfessa on the first stride, while the opponent is way out of your kill zone with maybe just 1 damage, isn't likely to get you the kill. So why not stride into something like a progenitor that sets you up for your kill stride better? This is something that sometimes a lot of people do in both formats, is that they will mechanically play their deck, but that doesn't mean that what they're doing is correct for the situation that they're in. I've been a victim of this myself. I have in many instances just strode Morfessa at BCS tournaments and just attempted to just all in for a first stride kill, even though that wasn't the correct decision to make. I should have strode Dragobus into setting up my board state defensively, drawing cards off Belial Owl, etc., and then getting SRS's Engrave, and then the second stride, since I will have the card economy to survive my opponent's stride, then push them in, since now I know they already invested, and most likely they 8 damage on that turn, so they're going to be at 3, 4, 5 damage, which is a lot more pressuring for me to have them in lethal. Does that extra damage add or take from the opponent? Most mid and lower players just mechanically attack their opponent, trying to make as much damage as possible without considering if giving that one more damage adds on or takes away from the opponent. This is something that I'm going to talk about actually because I was playing Vanguard Zero a lot actually. I'm very happy. I ended up getting 150th place on the global ladder, and this was something that dawned upon me that I didn't fully understand after reading this and talking to Mustafa about, is that Vanguard is a resource-based game. It is not a damage race, which is something that he brings up eventually. This is particularly true when giving the 5th damage. All that this does is give your opponent an extra counterblast and stop you from 5th damage healing on your opponent and putting you at a severe disadvantage. When before you could 5th damage heal and 6th damage heal for a lucky survival, you end up cutting your own chances in half. Not to mention that the 5th damage CB just might be what the opponent needs to end up making a final kill turn onto you. 2.2. When to not give them more damage. Knowing how to do this effectively and still not take away from your own kill con requires you to understand your deck damage profile. Some decks do 1, 2, 3, 3, or something like that. So if you know what your deck is going to do 3 next turn and kill the opponent at 4, then does giving them that 5th damage give or take away from the opponent? A lot of what he's saying is that when you attack based upon how your deck is designed, does your number of attacks in that turn equal enough either shield value out of your opponent's hand to strike lethal, or enough attacks to get your opponent to 5 to begin to strike lethal? Just like yourself, your opponent needs certain conditions to fulfill a kill condition. Bullet point 3. What does the opponent need to win? Just like yourself, your opponent needs certain conditions to fulfill a kill condition. And just like you, he is praying you won't break the kill condition. So more than mechanically go through your strategy, what I find more important is to figure out what your opponent's kill condition is and try to stop that from happening if you can't kill them on your turn. Bullet point 3.1. What does the opponent need to win? Sometimes it is one less counterblast, sometimes it is one less rearguard, sometimes you having less rearguards, sometimes it's not even attacking one more time in order to not give the opponent an excuse to use a second G guard that can enable an ultimate turn. This is where you really need to learn all the decks and how they work. This is the biggest difference between a mid-lower table and a mid-higher, not top table player. A lot of what he's saying here is that because a lot of this applies to premium, and in standard, yes, it does matter, where giving your opponent extra damage will actually result in certain things. But in premium, damage deny is a strategy that was developed during, I believe, Ange Choice when Kevin Adult was playing that, and a little bit of Guy's format also, because people just wanted to damage an eye to attempt their opponent to stop generating advantage, because if they gave them that one damage is just enough for them to keep reusing the counterblast and just absolutely just push their face in. So 3.2, opponent deck counterblast use profile. Every deck has a typical counterblast use profile. Some needs 1 counterblast on grade 2, 2 counterblast on grade 3 turn, etc. Knowing this profile is essential in deciding when and how to deliver damage in a way to push towards your kill condition without enabling your opponent's kill condition. So instead of just maximizing your deck's damage potential per turn, consider giving damage in a sensible way. For instance, OTT needs 1 counterblast at grade 2 for Rectangle Magus. If the opponent went first on your grade 1 turn, is exchanging a low probability crit for a high probability worth the trade, or hold off on the 1 damage attack, therefore by saving yourself 2 to 3 damage the next attack, making more sense. Setting up your next turn is important, but surviving the opponent's turn is more important because what's the point of all the setup if you're just going to die in your opponent's next turn? This is what you end up hearing a lot when low table players, not low tier exactly, say things like he got lucky because next turn I'm going to do my World Destruction combo. But unfortunately, there is no next turn. Recently, I fought this dude and I made a seemingly stupid move. He caught me on the move and said, "Why did you do this instead of that? If you if you do what you did, I'm going to kill you on my turn." And I said, "Sorry, there isn't going to be a next turn." And I killed him on that turn. I was able to make a high risk attempt at a kill turn only because thinly he depleted his defensives in the pursuit of a next turn kill. And I know what he's saying here in the sense of there are instances in which there is no next turn and you need to make a play happen. If you don't actively attempt to kill them right there in that turn that you have, there is no next turn for you. There are many instances in Premium, Standard, and just in all formats, Premium, Standard, even Vanguard Zero, where there is no next turn and you're going to need every card in your hands. Like, it doesn't matter. You're going to call down that PG and you're going to swing with it because there is no next turn. You're going to need everything that you have. Bullet point 4, how do you sweeten the lemonade? So your hand has been crap and your strategy isn't going to happen. Now you think Vanguard is all about luck and that the top guy is just the luckiest of them all. This is, I find, the biggest difference between a mid-higher table player and a top table player. The ability to reverse between a shit hand and a shit situation. This is when you need to know your deck's contingency lines and how to stall for time doing the above 3 bullet points with every resource that you have. Because bullet point 4.1, there is no such thing as a shit hand. If you set up your deck properly, it should consist of your main strategy, the core hand, cards that allow you to get the main strategy cards, the support hand, and triggers, the defensive hand. So drawing a handful of triggers at the start doesn't mean you have a shit hand. It means you have a defensive hand. It is your responsibility to learn how to play the core, support, and defensive hands of your deck. And too many people spend a lot of their time on the core, and then when the reality hits, they cannot react to this. So a simple flowchart of consideration may go something like this. At the start of the turn, you can assess, can I kill the opponent? Meaning reliably pushing to at least 7 damage, not 6. If yes, then properly execute the strategy that your deck is designed to do so. If no, refer to bullet points 2, 3, and 4. So something which is a concept that was also brought up to me by my friend Joko is that you need to deal 8 damage to your opponent. Now, in reality, they're going to heal once on 6. They're going to heal once on 6 and once during the game time, most likely, if they did not draw them. So, because of that, you're going to deal 6 damage, you're going to deal an extra damage because they're likely to resolve 1 heal per game, and then if they hit that heal on 6, you need to anticipate it, if anything. There will be many instances where I was playing Vanguard Zero, and I would intentionally swing not to kill my opponent at 6, but to kill them at 7. For example, I was one-tricking Shadow Paladin, so I would have right, left, and center column with PBD with a crit, and I would swing one, they'd guard it, or they'd push to like 5 damage, I'd swing the other line, and that second line most likely was a defense trigger or the heal on 6. And then I could swing with my center line to overkill them. Primarily, if you can, you would like to overkill your opponent because they can heal on 6, and because of that, they can just take the entire game. You and I both know that you've had many instances where you've just healed on 6 and you possibly unjustifiably won a game that you already lost, but you miracle healed, so you're able to run it back and take it back from them. Bullet point 5, knowledge of the opponent. The more you know about the opponent, the greater your ability in applying bullet points 2 to 4 above. 5.1, knowing the deck, mentioned above, knowing the opponent's deck entails knowing the general deck strategy, the counterblast use profile, defensive capability, and its damage-giving profile. 5.2, knowing how opponent plays. Every opponent plays the same deck differently. For instance, on a ballerina turn, some players exhaust their retires early, while some save it for later on. Both have pros and cons, and knowing this gives you big advantages. In fact, last weekend I was playing against a Magus OTT player, and I knew he always goes for scissors first in rock, paper, scissors, so I deliberately went paper, giving him the first ride in order to put him at a disadvantage. I proceeded to winning the game due to him wasting his grade 3 ride in a grade 2 stall. Bullet point 6, Psychological Advantage. The more psychological advantage you have over the opponent, the higher the chance the opponent is going to make a move that is less than optimal in order to prepare against an imaginary fear. 6.1, Cards in Hand. Having a lot of cards in hand makes the opponent all that more uneasy about making aggressive moves against you, especially if those moves cost counterblasts. As such, having two grade 2 rear guards on the field for 5k intercepts and having them in hand for 5k guards exerts a lower psychological pressure in terms of offense. Having them on the field and just 3 cards in hand makes the opponent so much more likely to come at you with everything that they have. But not having the rear guards but 5 cards in hand changes that thinking, even though it's the same amount of shield value in your hand, that they could possibly do something else. I ended up stuttering on my words for those last few sentences. But what he's saying here is that it is very easy for you to hold on to something in your hand and create psychological pressure with your opponent. And because of that, you can bait them into making poor decisions because they don't know what's in your hand. And they have to make assumptions based upon what is there. And they're very likely to make poor decisions, and these can actually be huge mistakes that you can capitalize on your turn. 6.2, Crit Pressure. Opening crits just makes people jumpy. Opening crits early can just make the opponent so much more likely to want to just full block you more often than rather just try to get lucky. You don't always need 12 crits to have this kind of effect. So what he's saying here is something that I've actually experienced before. When I would play Shadow Paladin in the city and I would ride the main or Swordbreaker and I would have to swing 5k into their 8, 1 to pass, they would fear a crit all the time because I ended up just getting very lucky and checking crits. In most of the instances where I had to swing 5 to 8, oh look, there's the crit, they eat 2 damage. So they would end up overguarding and wasting cards in hand because they were expecting me to check the crit. And you don't need to play 12 crit to have that effect. It is very easy for you to have a lot of psychological pressure on your opponent if you end up checking crits grades 1 and 2 and just pressuring them mentally because they're at high damage. And if you check the crit the next turn, even though statistically you are unlikely to, since crits are already removed out of your deck early on, they're going to overcommit cards in hand. 6.3, Aura of Confidence. Just displaying an aura of confidence with a smirk on your face, always despite a shit hand, just might make the opponent think that you're in control and discourages the opponent from being too aggressive or encourages them to become reckless. 6.4, Game Tempo. Having a faster game tempo makes the opponent feel like they are trying to sing a slow song in a rock concert. It's just incredibly difficult. In fact, many players get pulled into your tempo and make mistakes and misplays. So if you are comfortable with playing just a tad faster, you can exert psychological pressure on your opponent just because of that. There was an instance where this happened actually at a BCS in Albany. Demiurge, regardless of what the deck was, he ended up playing fast intentionally to make his opponent play fast as a scare tactic. And so later in the game, his opponent ended up misplaying and using the stand trigger monochrome cat, and he forgot to stride completely. And he didn't realize when it was too late. 6.5, Attack Sequences. Your attack sequence can exert mental pressure too. Going rear guard, vanguard exerts lower mental pressure than rear, vanguard. Specific situations varies, but rear, vanguard is standard, so your opponent will just mechanically block both rear guards and take the vanguards. There's no pressure there. But if you go rear, van, rear, you throw the opponent off on the vanguard, as he is now forced to decide if they have enough to guard for a 2x crit. because you can pass the crit onto the final rearguard or take the Vanguard and still have to handle a much bigger rearguard than before due to passing on the power. Both approaches have merits, but I am just stating that this is an example of exerting pressure through attack sequence. 6.6 Damage status. Simply having more damage than the opponent exerts pressure and sometimes changes the way people play, especially at lower tables. At higher tables, I find that having 5 damage changes nothing about the way people play, but at lower tables, players seem overly absorbed by the damage race and panics when they're put into 4 or 5 damage. Also, at 4 or 5 damage, you lose initiative and guarding, so that also exerts pressure. This is going back to the concept before. Being at 4 or 5 damage doesn't exactly mean much in terms of game state, other than you're forced to guard more because you no longer have the luxury to no guard attacks. And your card economy and guarding becomes incredibly more important. However, a lot of lower table players or low tier players will emotionally react to being at high damage. And for attack sequence, this is something that I was taught as well. So let's say you're going second and you just ride grade 1 and call 2 grade 1 rears. You have triple swing right there in turn 2, and this is a rush tactic, and it's very easy for you to take cards out of your opponent's hand. But if the most correct thing for you to do, considering the fundamentals of Vanguard, is rear guard, Vanguard. This takes out the most away from your opponent, but this is very mechanical and very methodical. Now, if you go rear, Vanguard, rear guard, you are creating a lot more psychological pressure onto your opponent because if you swing rear, they should guard it. If you swing Van, then you now pressure because if they no guard and you check a crit, then that is 2 damage to them, and this rear is now much more powerful. If they guard the center line, then you are forcing them to exert more shield value because you can put all trigger effects onto the other rear guard so that this comes in and that they have to also invest for that. And because it is the early game, you don't have that many cards in hand, so it is very easy for you to lose momentum turns 1 and 2 because you are being pressured from that early on and you have to commit cards just for guarding or you're just going to end up eating damage. 6.6 Tournament Experience. Having played a lot more bigger tournaments gives you an instant psychological advantage over a less experienced player. You could sometimes visibly see the opponent hand shaking and eyes blur out when the mental pressure has built to the point that you want. This is something else that some people understand, but a lot of people don't. Um, I've been very fortunate. I have been very fortunate to travel to certain PCSs actually. Um, and because of that, I, as a player, especially going into New York City, I as a player have a higher mental fortitude than a lot of people at my locals because they have never been under those amounts of immense pressure before. Some people at my locals have only played at that locals. And so that is the highest competitive tier that they have ever experienced Vanguard at. Thus, taking them to, say, New York City or taking them into a BCS or Team League or something like that, ARGs when they used to happen, they haven't not experienced that amount of pressure before. And I've seen friends of mine literally crumble and just mechanically misplay or mentally check out because they've never been at that level before and they've never had such physical and mental and mechanical demands put onto them in that way before. Okay, let me reread this. So bullet point 7, choosing a deck. You always hear people say that this deck can do this and therefore it is OP. But when you review major tournament results, those decks rarely turn up or rarely top. Now the question is why? Because essentially the moment-to-moment decisions required, because essentially the moment-to-moment decision making and chess-like playing the opponent situation is the way to win at higher tables. Mechanically relying only on your deck performing a certain way to win rarely works. As such, for me, the most important consideration when choosing a deck is So that's a bit of a blunder for me. My brain just couldn't read that because of his English. So I'm going to bring up something here, actually. So this is actually an excerpt from a Cimo video where he says exactly this. When you see some of those When you see some of these rogue strategies emerging and managing to take the top cut, these players found that their decks actually had strengths against the top meta contenders, and that's why they were able to compete. They didn't just randomly pick a deck, they tested it against the best decks, learning how to deal with the best decks, exploit the weaknesses of them, and being to see more success. This is something that happens all the time in competitive games where, especially in Vanguard, so I'm going to make the analogies there, but you will have a deck, and this deck is the meta. Now, this deck is the best deck of the format. However, some people will choose to play this deck, but other people will try to counter it in some way. So, an example is, let's say, An's Choice is the best deck. I actually saw this happen. Um, I think back when Kevin won Secaucus, he he changed his deck list to counter the meta and his previous deck list because he knew people were going to net deck that previous list and not innovate upon it. Thus, he ended up making a lot of changes to it and he ended up winning. It is very possible that certain decks can just be played because they have favorable matchups into whatever the top contenders are, and they can just actually recur a lot of advantages and easily make that matchup not a problem. So when considering a deck for him, the most important things were 7.1, the advantage engine. The deck must have strong advantage engines that other decks cannot easily overcome, as those ride chains, OTT, crit discovery, Bermuda Triangle's absurd defense and offense, power in the grade 1 game, etc. etc. 2. A tool set. Apart from having a strong advantage engine, the decks need to give you a diverse set of tools to overcome various situations and to be able to be flexible and raise the skill ceiling. For example, Neonectar might have a strong advantage engine, but its non-existent tool set also meant less flexibility against changing situations and consistently low skill ceiling. And 3. The matchups. Some decks may fulfill the top two, but if they have a bad matchup which you expect to run into that tournament, you will need to consider if you can overcome that matchup or change deck. Expanding upon 2, I forget where, but I believe um, I believe it was Premium Collection came out, whatever, and like everyone knew that like Neonectar was bonkers because of Katrina. I believe Secaucus Jersey got 7 out of 8 Neonectar for top 8, but Ezel won. And then, if I'm correct, eventually people stopped playing Neonectar because people started finding counters to it in a way. For example, Eagle, Honolulu, better decks at the time. Like the deck was strong, yes, but the deck actually didn't have tools to encounter situations. It was a very one and done kind of strategy. It would just beat face, but then that was it. It wouldn't do anything beyond that. So there were other decks were having skill sets and having tool sets and increasing the skill ceiling of the deck through what you can do actually was better than just choosing a deck that works, let's say 95% of the time, and the only thing that stops it from working is like bricking or whatever. 8. Playing around luck. This is a concept Jonathan Vallejo and I were discussing a while ago, and after a few months of lucky wins, I think I got a good sense of how it works. You hear a lot of people say that they lost because the opponent got lucky, but they rarely ask themselves why they don't get lucky wins. Because there are just times that you need to play around luck and times that you need to let luck win for. And these are some examples. 8.1, the 2 to pass. The opponent is at 4 damage and they 2 to pass your Vanguard. You drew a crit trigger. Most pros will give the crit power to a rear guard in case the second one doesn't turn up. So what he's saying here is that your first stripe check revealed a crit trigger, and the correct scenario is that you should put the crit power, you should put all effects to the other rear guard that is standing, because that's going to give you the max value for. The second trigger does turn up, and then once again he gives us the rear guard, which is then eventually just blocked with a one card guard or whatever. And this is an opportunity where they missed a chance to actually allow variance to end the game for him right then and there. And there are sometimes instances where people will just tutor past me, and I just decide to go for it because I don't lose anything by going for it. In mid to late game scenarios, there are definitely instances where they will tutor past me and I will choose to go all divan because if I do, I win the game. If I do not, and I put everything to the rear guard, which is the correct decision to make, I know that card is going to get guarded. That column, or that another attack, is going to be guarded. 8.2, the high risk, high reward guard. Yes, we should always guard rear, and then no guard the vanguard, because this is what provides you the most card economy. That gives you the most consistent and most predictable damage return. However, if you can count your triggers and you can see that you have a high chance of hitting a trigger, then take that first rear guard attack, and then brick the rest of the opponent's turn. Going from taking 1 damage and losing 2 cards to just taking the 1 damage and losing no cards in hand can be huge if you manage to pull it off once. And of course, you have to be ballsy enough to let luck work for you sometimes. And now, denying the opponent luck. Now that you know that you can make luck work for you, you need to know how to deny the opponent the chance for luck working for them. This includes 15k guards in the early game against the opponent's vanguard, that has slightly lower power because they can't actually break through it, even if they check a crit. For example, if you swing 8 to my 8 and I drop a crit, that's a no pass right there, even if you check the trigger. Not 2 to passing the opponent's stride on 4 damage unless doing so depletes your shields, such as an opponent's rearguard can kill you. Punishing the opponent by following up with a vanguard attack for not getting unlucky on using high risk guard and rearguard and failing. And also a classic case of denying the opponent luck is the 4 damage rule, in which you always attack with the vanguard or side that guarantees 2 damage, rather than the side that grants you 1 damage and gives the opponent to check a D trigger, spoiling your kill. This is something that I was taught a while ago. What he's saying in that end of 8.3 is that if your opponent is at 4 damage, you want to swing Vanguard first because your Vanguard always has a theoretical crit. Because you could check a crit and you win the game right there. What you don't want to do is swing a rear first because that is 1 damage. Worst case scenario, you swing, they take, and then they hit a D trigger, and then it actually really hurts the remainder of your turn. What you want to do is swing because that crit always has value. If you swing at Vanguard to Vanguard and they're at 4 damage, if you check the crit, that is threatening. If they no guard it, you check the crit, you put it Van, 2 damage, you win the game. If you check the crit and they guard it, you put it to the side, you still retain max value because it is force shield value out of their hand. I was playing League for a while and I was looking at a lot of top solo queue players, people just playing the rank ladder, and trying to draw conclusions between like mindsets and things like that. And this is something that I also came up with, and I'm just going to read this document and also expand upon this. Honestly, when I compare myself to other players, I don't see too many differences. However, as people play more games, there are subsequent mistakes based upon their judgments and decisions. This is how you make your decisions in game. You have to look forward to the optimal situations, but what does that really mean? Let's say you're staring down 3 attacks from your opponent, and they're all 1-card guards, and you have the cards in hand to guard them. Now from here, what do you have to do? The best case scenario is that you take the first damage, and it's a D trigger, shutting off the remaining attacks. However, guarding when it's cheap is the most effective. Thus, the correct play is to guard each attack. Maybe you feel that you'll hit a damage trigger, but you can't make those decisions based upon intuition. Let's say you take the damage and the result is good. You hit the damage trigger. Now you don't have to guard the remaining attacks. But was that the best decision? It definitely wasn't. That was just that game. The one game where you ended up getting lucky. This is results-oriented thinking, making decisions based upon outcomes rather than logic. It is very easy to get into a feedback loop of results-oriented thinking because X scenario was presented, you made a Y decision, and that was a good decision because it resulted in something positive. It is very possible that people make incorrect decisions or decisions that are wrong or bad because they're not being punished for it. Also, after all the variables, people will struggle to be consistent. However, consistency within a player will always create advantages. Even if the game is being lost slowly, if you play this way and the opponent makes one mistake, it is a direct advantage. Rather than playing to catch up, a direct advantage. So if you are playing consistent and you're just slowing the game down and you're letting it go later and later and later and later, eventually the moment that your opponent makes a mistake is monumental because the longer the game goes, triggers won't matter and every card in hand matters. Because there have been instances, and I'm pretty sure you as a viewer can experience this or tell your own stories where you had an incredible long game and that 5k shield was just needed for that one attack. And that's more so the concept which I'm trying to talk about. If you only make optimal decisions, even with a disadvantageous game, it is possible just to win by prolonging the game state and making those consistent decisions. You want to play with consistency, disregard deviations, and always look for the optimal place. I personally believe that playing at a variance separates good players from great players sometimes, and it is very difficult to pinpoint the differences between playing at a variance and just being lucky. However, the situations where risk/reward and opportunity costs have to be identified, it is very possible for you to play into luck and yield a game-changing result. Um, I've done this in the TCG, I've done this in both formats, I've done this in Vanguard Zero. It is very possible that you need to break the 2 to pass and just go for game. This is something that I briefly just touched on before within Jason's document, but the point still does stand. There are some times where you can actually play bad and play for the trigger, even though you know that it's a variance-based play, but if you hit it, you can end up just winning right then and there. Bullet point 9, understanding damage. Damage is not equal. 1 damage now is very different from 1 damage later. Here are some considerations when it comes to damage. 9.1, shield value of damage. The amount of shield you need to block 1 damage increases with game progression, because it scales naturally because power increases. The shield value of grade 2 attacks may only be 5k per damage, while the shield value of a strat attack might as well be 50k or above. This is why guarding early helps so much, as it takes a lot less shield value to prevent that 1 damage early on than later. Bullet point 9.2, lethality of damage. 1 damage when you have no damage is completely non-lethal, but 1 damage when you're at 5 or 4 can be absolutely destructive. Damage grows in lethality closer to 6. It is common sense, but people fail to understand the implications of this common sense. A lot of what this is actually just guarding when it's cheap, because it is very easy for you to drop cards early on and stay at low damage without completely depleting your hand size, because you can guard early, because you can't guard massive attacks later on, because, I don't know, they're swinging in with, like, Skull Dragons, or who knows, and you just can't actually throw the cards in your hand to even get that high. Bullet point 10, how much damage to kill? If you answered 6, then you're one of the many who often claims to die due to a 6 damage heal, and I did too, a lot. People who thinks you need to only give 6 damage to kill usually throws everything into that 6 damage turn in an attack and proceeds to and that produces a just nice 6 damage, and when the opponent gets a 6 damage heal, they die on the opponent's turn due to running out of resources. On average, you need 8 damage to kill. And this is what I was talking about before earlier in the video and document. So if your opponent is at 4 damage, then don't start throwing everything in unless you can do 4 damage in one turn. These days, when your opponent checks the 6 damage heal, the crowd goes wow, and he's barely moved, because he doesn't plan that to be the final attack unless they draw one more heal. But he won't survive, as he always plans for his kill turn to be for the 7th damage. This is what I was talking about before. In TCG Vanguard and even in Zero, I would do this a lot. I would anticipate the 6 damage heal because it is very possible that that will happen due to natural variance of the game. And if you want to guarantee wins, more so, is that you want to play for it. You want to overkill your opponent ideally, because if you put everything into that 6 damage, they can heal, and all your resources have been thrown out the window. Bullet point 11, what Vanguard is not. 11.1, damage race. Vanguard is not rushing damage as quickly as possible, aka damage racing. If this is the core strategy of your deck, it is not likely a deck that can go far in a major tournament. Damage giving is a strategic decision that must be given only to extent and not furthering your opponent's strategy, or to the extent that you are not allowing the opponent to kill you in their turn. This is something that I know can be a very bad habit for myself and a lot of people, is that they will just, I know New York City does this so much. They will hand to board, swing, and try to damage race you. However, the moment that it fails and the moment that you begin to gain momentum of the game, that strategy completely fails. It is very easy to get into this bad habit of damage racing, just basically hand to board swing, because that kind of blast that you're giving your opponent is actually a resource, and sometimes people don't just fully understand that. It is absolutely a cheese strat that can be done, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the longer the game goes as a card game, that it's a good strategy to do. Because it is very easy for you to just cheese your opponent out of the game by damage racing them, but it doesn't mean that damage racing against a higher tier player will actually yield the same result. 11.2, Gentleman Sport. Vanguard is not a gentleman's sport. Even top players will strategically forget and strategically misplay, forgetting that you need to Soul Blast 2 instead of Soul Blast 1, forgetting you need a Counterblast for certain abilities, forgetting an ability is GB1. This is a low class one because when you get caught you can't take it back since you already placed it for that ability. Forgetting that a certain ability is on place only, etc. Give the person who forgets a huge edge if not caught. And even if caught, you can just take a humble apology and correct it, allowing them to allowing them to get away with the attempt. And you need to be on your guard with this. This is no gentleman's sport. This is something that definitely happens at higher tier events, is people will try to soft cheat in a way where they will do something, like forget to pay cost of abilities, etc., try to do certain things. This definitely happens at major events because it is very possible that you can end up with someone who is an uneducated player in some capacity, just due to the population of the event. And you can just do something and completely get away with it. So this is something that I recommend people are very aware of, is that you want to naturally read your opponent's cards, but you also want to know what your opponent's deck does, of course, to make sure that they don't accidentally misplay in some capacity and end up cheating on you, possibly just stealing a win from you. 11.3, winning with 6 damage. Again, as mentioned above, Vanguard is about winning at 7 or 8 damage, so if you're playing the 6 damage game, you're at a huge disadvantage and will often lose to luck. This is once again the concept of dealing 8 damage to your opponent. They are likely to resolve 1 damage, 1 heal trigger, during the course of the game, and it is very possible that they can heal on 6, so you anticipate the extra damage. So ideally dealing 8 damage to your opponent. 11.4, the same in casual and tourney. You'll be surprised how different a tournament play and a casual play can be. You may be the top dog in casual play, but find yourself completely hopeless and making heaps of mistakes in tournament. This is something that definitely comes with time, and this is something that I didn't really view consistently. This is something that Salah mentioned before, is that there are definitely people who are local heroes. Basically, they're the best person at their locals, and they have Dunning-Kruger. But once they actually go to any larger event or other people come to their shop that have that competitive experience, they just absolutely lose it and they don't properly know how to handle the pressure. 11.5, a card game. Vanguard is not a card game. Vanguard is a human-to-human game. It is one human fighting another human, not one deck fighting another deck. Understanding this greatly changes many aspects of how you approach this game. Vanguard is a card game. Yes, however, you are fighting an opponent. You are fighting a human. You are not fighting a robot or a computer that has all the answers and knows how to follow the decision trees. So it is very possible that you can make a lot of psychological decisions to end up getting edges on your opponent. And this is something that comes with time and understanding how people at your locals interact, understanding how people interact humanly in psychology. And it's very difficult for me to dissect this as a concept unless you naturally have that competitive experience yourself. Then you know what I'm talking about when you're face to face with another person and they give away many, many subtle hints that actually tell you what's going on with their deck or their board state or game state. 12. The perfect turn. Hence, in my opinion, the perfect turn is one where you push towards your kill condition while giving the opponent just enough damage to exert pressure, but still not allowing your opponent to trigger their counterblast-based kill condition. Of course, this won't be a concern against certain decks that are not counterblast reliant. At the same time, though, having enough resources to survive the opponent's turn. 13. What it takes to be a competitive Vanguard player, aka a tryhard. It's the best It's the deck that makes the player, but the player who makes the deck. A competitive Vanguard player changes decks all the time but keeps things consistent. 1. Vanguard Basics. A strong sense of the 5 basics of Vanguards: damage rules, guarding rules, attack patterns, memorizing the opponent's hands, and shuffling techniques. So many people, so many times I see people lose because they make a damage rule mistake without even knowing it. 2. Understanding of what works, quote unquote. The meta changes all the time. A competitive player always knows what works and what makes decks work based upon that. And 3. Flawless execution. If you cannot flawlessly execute your deck strat, you can never be competitive. There's no such thing as putting down a rear guard and just taking it back at a competitive tournament. I hope you guys find this useful, and credits to all the teachers in the appearance for his life: Jason Lee, Jonathan Vallejo, Kevin Ajolt, and Sarah Michelle. So I'm also going to link or put an annotation for another video, which is about 5 minutes, where he also continues to talk about being a tryhard Vanguard player, a competitive Vanguard player more so. Um, but overall, this is something that I'm very happy to share with people, and I hope you enjoy it. Thank you very much for watching, and enjoy.